Good evening. My name is Peter Crow. I'm the Dean of the School of Foreign Service, and it is my privilege on behalf of the school and the Department of History to welcome you to the renovated Gaston Hall and to an occasion this evening at which we honor an established institution and inaugurate a new one. The established institution is Professor Carroll Quigley, whose teaching has quickened and disciplined the minds of generations of School of Foreign Service students. His inspired lectures over a span of 40 years, delivered to literally thousands of students, have for these students defined the school, their education, and frequently themselves. This series of lectures, which Professor Quigley begins this evening, enables us in several senses to recapture the past and to illustrate a legend. It gives us the opportunity as well to reassemble, to be educated once again under the spirit of this awesome, some would say downright formidable intellect. It is an occasion as well to inaugurate a new institution at the School of Foreign Service, which is the Oscar Iden Lecture Series. This lecture series has been endowed through the creative philanthropy of Oscar Iden, School of Foreign Service class of 1924. This endowed lecture series is intended by him to sharpen the school community's view of the world and the U.S. role in it. And we thought of no better way to initiate this series than to entrust it to Professor Quigley, who knows more about the world than any man we know. Professor Quigley, the stage, Gaston Hall, and this audience, I am confident to say, are now yours.
Dean Crow, ladies and gentlemen, and the people who laughed at that. For a decade, from 1931 to 1941, my chief intellectual concern was with the growth of public authority and the development of the European state. I dreamed at that time that at some date in the future, perhaps 30 years in the future, I would write the definitive history of the growth of the European state. But in 1941, I had to postpone indefinitely and gradually abandon that project. I no longer, after 1941, had adequate libraries, and it would take a very extraordinary library for the purpose, of which there are only a couple in the United States, perhaps. I was much too busy with my teaching, which I enjoyed thoroughly. But above all, I discovered that other historians were so specialized in their studies and were so lacking in basic historical concepts, such as, what does state mean? In what way is state different from many other things? Such as public authority, government, and so forth. That they could not understand what I had to say. And I had a bitter experience which revealed that. Namely, in my doctoral dissertation, which was on the public administration of the Napoleonic Kingdom of Italy, which I wrote between 1936 and 1938. I will not go into the story. I will simply say that there was only one man who read it who had the slightest idea what it was all about, and that was the great University of Florence historian Salvemini, who at that time was a refugee in this country. But most historians knew only one country. They knew England, or they knew France, or they might have known Italy, or they might have known Germany. And most historians knew only certain periods. And, of course, the period I was writing about, the Napoleonic Kingdom of Italy, was technically from 1805 to 1814. And anyone who knew that period, I discovered, really didn't know anything about what the situation had been like before the Revolution, the French Revolution of 1789. So instead of writing that, I got into what I suppose was really my much stronger activity, the creation of the necessary conceptual paradigms, structures, frameworks for understanding historical processes. Because I discovered that people could not, historians could not even understand their own specialties because of their lack of concepts. Let me give you two examples of this. One of them very contemporary. That is, it's the last 100 years, which to me is contemporary. There is an area of political activity, and for about 100 years, and in all political argument and controversy today, there is a basic assumption that only two kinds of interests or entities operate in the area of political action. That is, individuals and the government. There have been numerous books published with such titles as Man versus the State. I know two of those. Both appeared, I think, in 1906. We hear about big government as a threat to the individual, and so forth and so forth. Conservatives now are telling us that we must curtail government, cut government spending, cut government powers, reduce government personnel for the sake of making individuals more free. Liberals, on the other hand, are still telling us, as they have for a long, long time, that in order to make individuals free, we must destroy communities. By communities, I mean villages, ghettos and cities, ethnic groupings, religious groupings, anything which is segregated. We must destroy them so that all individuals would be, if possible, identical, including boys and girls. But the area of political action and I won't draw it on here, but just assume a circle of political action in which you have government, individuals acting in there. But you also have at least two other groups, really three others, voluntary associations, which I'll say no more about, corporations, and communities. And if the liberals destroy communities for the sake of the individual, and the conservatives destroy big government for the sake of individual, you're going to have an area of political action in which irresponsible and immensely powerful corporations are engaged in opposition to individuals who are socially naked and indefenseless. And what we get in history is never what anyone is struggling for. What we get in history is the resultant of diverse groups struggling. And if liberals and conservatives are struggling for these things, that was what the result will be. That's one example of a lack of a paradigm. I've given you the paradigm. The next one is more personal. A number of years ago, an old friend of mine, we were colleagues at Princeton in the history department in 1936 and 37, wrote a book, The Age of the Democratic Revolution. Now, since neither of the revolutions that he talked about were democratic, neither the one in France nor the one in the United States were not intended to be and did not turn out to be democratic revolutions, people have changed this and talk about the 18th century revolution. But they talk as if the 18th century revolution in, let's say, the United States and France and in other places was the same kind of a revolution. Now, Bob Palmer is a very industrious person with a very agile mind and a ready verbalizer, but he does not know what he means by revolution or by democratic. And he's totally wrong if he believes the 18th century revolution in the United States or the English-speaking world in general was the same as the 18th century revolution in France. In fact, they were the opposite. The revolution in France was a struggle by a government which did not have sovereignty to obtain sovereignty, which to us would be the essential identifying characteristic of any state, sovereignty. The English-speaking revolution through the 18th century and in the United States very clearly was an effort by states who had sovereignty to curtail it, divide it up, hamper it by such things as federalism, separation of powers, electoral colleges, and so forth and so forth. Now, this is what I mean by the need for paradigms. The basic entity to understand is the civilization as a whole. And although I give you the date that I'm going to talk about the last 1,000 years, Western civilization, of which we are a part, has been around for a considerable time longer than that. I think we might say perhaps that Western civilization began around 600. It came out of the ruins and wreckage of the preceding classical civilization. And classical civilization's dates might well be 1100 BC through a dark age in 1000 BC, and it ended about 550 AD and was followed by a dark age around 850 or 876, 100 years before the outline begins this lecture. Out of the wreckage of classical civilization, which was the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, that was classical civilization, and it was held together by the fact that the ease of water transportation on the Mediterranean was so superior to the difficulties of land transportation away from the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, that the city of Rome could bring its food from Egypt when it could not bring food from Lombardy in Italy. And anywhere in the Mediterranean Sea, even at the height of the Roman Empire, if you went into the interior a few hundred miles, you had left civilization. That civilization perished, and out of the wreckage came 4 other civilizations: Islam, Byzantium, Russia, and Western. And I think we might say they all were sort of around from 600 onward, and certainly by 950 they were around. Now, another paradigm that I want to establish is a difference between 2 kinds of civilizations, which means a difference between 2 kinds of governments in these. Asiatic civilizations generally do not attempt to deal with individuals or with the problems of individuals. I have always called that Class B civilization. Class A civilization is the kind of civilization that classical antiquity, classical civilization turned into, the kind that we are moving toward and have been from the beginning, or the kind that was found in the first Chinese civilization, which was from 1800 BC to 400 AD, and to distinguish it from the Chinese civilization, which was from 400 to about 1930, we call that earlier one Sinic, S-I-N-I-C, from the Latin word for China, which is Sinia. In those Class A civilizations, although the civilization starts by being an area of common culture made up of communities, in our type of civilization, there is a long-term trend to destroy and break down communities. Now, the way I would like to express it would be, and I just draw it on the back blackboard, by saying that a civilization, all civilizations start out as aggregations of communities. Those communities are generally of 2 types, either local, such as parishes, neighborhoods, villages, manors, or whatever else they may be, or kinship communities, families, clans, and so forth. And when civilization begins with communities such as this, as ours did in 600, let us say, there is no state, and there is no atomized individual. Now, I won't go into the details of this, but in such communities, everything is different. There are no written laws. It's all customary. All controls, or most controls, are what I call internalized. That is, they're built into your hormones and your neurological responses, and you do what is necessary to remain a member of the community, because if you weren't a member of the community, you would be nothing. You would not be a man. And as you may know, if you've ever studied linguistics, many of the names which primitive peoples have, or even not quite so primitive peoples, have for themselves is their word for man. That is, unless you were a member of their community, you were not a man. Now, what happens in the course of civilization, it may, like in ours, take 1,000 or more years. It took 1,500 years in Cynic civilization. And it took about 1,000 years in classical antiquity. Is that those communities are broken out and gradually break down to smaller and smaller groups, and they end up simply as what we call nuclear families, a father and a mother. And then you would discover they lose all of their discipline and control of their own children. And the holders and controllers of property become isolated individuals and so forth. And what happens is you end up with a state which is not only sovereign but totalitarian. And it is filled with isolated individuals who face a totalitarian state. The communities, of course, from which classical antiquity came were clans. That is, the kinship group. The communities from which Western civilization came were local villages and manors. And indeed, the communities always are either one or the other. And lucky civilizations, such as Chinese civilization over the last 1,500 years or more, has generally communities which are both kinship and local. If a society has just kinship communities like Islamic civilization, it is in a very, very bad position. It never, for example, can understand the meaning of the word state. There is no real Arabic word for state. And you may reach the point that the Arabs tended to reach, which was, since you trusted no one except your close relatives, the preferred marriage would be your parallel first cousin. That is, your father's brother's daughter is the one you must marry. Because no one else, and even then you don't trust her. All right. Now, of the four civilizations which came out of classical antiquity's wreckage, two of them clearly are a different kind of a civilization from ours, and I think Russia is too. What I'm saying is that I think those three, Islamic, Byzantine, and this I'm certain, and probably Russia also, are class B civilizations. That is, they continue to work for communities. I will take back about the Russia. Let's forget the Russia. It's very much too complicated. We just looked at the Islamic and the Byzantine. On the other hand, Western civilization was different. The civilizations and the governments which appeared in Class B civilizations, those which preserved communities, were governments of limited power. The chief powers that they had were raising money and recruiting soldiers. And they made no effort to deal with interpersonal relations or anything else. They were a kind of an empire. The finest example of that is the empire of Genghis Khan. But a very good example of it would be the Ottoman Empire, which is the final empire of Islamic civilization and which was destroyed in 1922, where you did not attempt to deal with the relationships of individuals. You left that to their local or their kinship communities. Now, before I get deeply into Western civilization, I want to say one more thing about classical antiquity. A moment ago, I said there would be difficulty talking to historians about this subject. The difficulties would be just as great in talking about classical history, a classical civilization, if I spoke to classicists. Classical civilization began with clans as the basic community. So where this proved, at the beginning of classical civilization, were kinship groups of clans, And at the beginning of our Western civilization were little self-sufficient villages across Europe in deep forests mostly, where these were of that isolated and different nature. Such communities are totalitarian. That is to say, everything that you get, which makes you a human being, you get from your community. But since in classical civilization they gradually built up a state, and eventually a totalitarian state, one of the reasons they built up a totalitarian state is this. Classicists, for centuries, could not see that there was a difference between a society and a state. When Aristotle says, the polis, I won't translate it, the polis, P-O-L-I-S, is a koinonia, a community. He means a totalitarian group which gives you everything. He says a man cut off from the polis is not a man. He just looks like a man. He's like a thumb cut off from a hand. It looks like a thumb, but it isn't. It's just a piece of meat. So the word polis in Aristotle and in Plato, and this is late, this is the 4th century, the society is already at least 6 centuries old. Now eventually the polis, of which there were many, was replaced by the imperium, of which there was one. But they continued to find it utterly impossible to see a distinction between the society in which you live, which gives you everything which makes you a man, rather than some kind of an animal, and the state, which has the monopoly or the large part of the political power in that society. So the polis, we say, was a city-state. It was a community, but it was also a state. And when they came to the imperium hundreds of years later, it was the same way. The imperium was a community. Now, in order to clarify this, I have to point out a few things. First, no other communities were approved of, and in many cases in Roman history, no other communities were permitted. Every society has what we might call the orthodox theory of the state for that society. And every society has the suppressed heresy of the state in that society. In the society of the classical antiquity, the orthodoxy was that the state is the community, and no one should desire any else. No one should desire a private life. Everybody's life should be public. Everyone should be prepared to give up anything, including his life, for the state, because the state is his community. And if he says, I'm going to go off and found my own commune, he, by that state, becomes a traitor. One of the first ones to do that was Epicurus, who was the 4th century BC. And Epicurus said all he wanted to do was to sit down in a quiet garden with his friends and talk and ignore politics. We're about to be approaching that in our society today. We haven't reached the point yet where we're about to because we are like classical antiquity. We're trying to, in our society, to grind down individuals into identical atoms in a mass culture in which all communities are disapproved. And if any community wishes to stand apart, we will go in by force and bust them out or bust them in or do anything that is necessary to make them become the kind of red-blooded Americans that all want to be. Now, then, the state in classical antiquity was totalitarian because it was regarded as a community. Now, once the classical civilization was gone, the whole configuration of civilized and cultural society in the West, at the west of Eurasia, was transformed. Where the Mediterranean Sea had been the site of classical civilization, it became instead, by the year 700, the barrier between Arabic civilization, I'll do it from your point of view, there's the Mediterranean Sea, Arabic civilization to the south, Byzantine civilization to the northeast, Western civilization to the northwest. And the Mediterranean, instead of being an area of communication, became an area of frontier with a different society. A community is not easy to define, but I would define it approximately this way. If you trust everyone you meet automatically until they prove to be unworthy of trust, then you are in your community. On the other hand, if you distrust everyone you meet until they prove worthy of trust, then you are in an alien community. You're in Moscow, or someplace like that. This would be a workable definition, it seems to me, of the two. Now, if I go back to the history of Western civilization, which began around 600, what we see is an effort being made after the civilization got started to establish the kind of totalitarian state structure which had been successfully established just about 600 in Byzantium, or which was established shortly after this, 1650, in the Caliphate of Islamic civilization, or which was established at least by 600 or 700 BC in Cynic civilization. That is to say, I forget now what my line of thought would be here. A kind of monarchy, which I will give you now as a paradigm. It's called providential monarchy. And it is associated with the idea of a providential deity. To us today, who shove religion off into a corner somewhere and insist that religion mustn't have anything to do with communities, or certainly nothing to do with politics, or business, or many, many other things, it is hard perhaps to grasp that one of the most potent things in establishing the structure of the state in any civilization has always been men's ideas of the nature of deity. And I will not give you my paradigm for that. I will simply point out to you something which must be obvious to you. The deity, God, has many different attributes. He's creator, he's masculine, he's up, he's transcendental, that is, he's outside of the world of space and time, that was established by 500 BC. Eventually, he's one. That's what Muhammad insisted on. God is one. And then, that he is omnipotent, all-powerful. Now, I stop at this point. Providential empires never got further than this. Now, the next thing that developed in our ideas of deities in Western civilization were that God is good. That was established by the prophet from the desert, certainly by the 5th century BC. And then came the Christian message that God is love. And then came the scholastic inference that God is pure reason by the year 1250 AD. Now, what you believe to be the nature of God in many civilizations, including our own, has helped to determine the structure of the society. And the crucial one I want to point out here is this. By 500 BC, in Western Asia, it was pretty well established that God is omnipotent. He can do anything. And there is nothing he cannot do. Thus, he is pure will. And at almost the same time came the other idea, which you find in Job, that God is good. But if God is good, he cannot do anything. He can only do things that are good. And if he can only do things that are good and cannot do things that are evil, then there is something higher than God. The rule of ethics. Thus, the great contribution, even before Christ, moving toward the Western idea of deity, was the idea of transcendental ethical monotheism. To which Christ added that God is love. And so forth. And it always has things. Now, if God is one, and God is all-powerful, and he can do anything, and he is providential, which means he interferes in the world, then whatever happens in the world is because he permitted it. And whatever he permitted, who the hell is any ordinary human being to question it? Now, if you read Job, you'll see that this begins to come into that contradiction, that conversation, where Job is saying, God, you're running the world all wrong. You're letting bad people be elected president and so forth. You're not to avoid it. Now, this is providential monarchy. Let me read what I wrote here about it. In providential monarchy, deity is, and it's Asiatic, heaven. Chinese word is yin, which means heaven. The idea in the original Indo-European was something like deist. Deist, from which Deus came, and from which Zeus, which is Zeus, came, and so forth. It meant bright, brilliant sky. That was the deity. And this was a being of willful and arbitrary omnipotence. And if there is a ruler on earth, that ruler was picked by the deity. This means you must accept whatever happens. It leads, of course, as you can see, to fatalism, even though they don't accept that in their actions frequently. And the ruler is the vicar of omnipotent will on earth. Now, this has a number of things. There is no rule of law. There is a rule of God's will. This is the heresy of the West. When the Crusades went to to capture Jerusalem. And their war cry was, God rules it. They should have been rejected. This is not Western. Because the Western idea is that God gives man free will. And if he does evil things, he's responsible. And so forth. A totally different kind of thing. In the West, you get accordingly the rule of law. In providential monarchy, you do not get. You get the rule of will. And the slogan very quickly became, one God in heaven, one ruler on earth, which meant that providential monarchs consistently tried to conquer the world. And these are the great world conquerors, and I've already said Genghis Khan was the greatest of them. And very much worth studying. His government, his army, his whole attitude is a magnificent machine for world conquest and world rule as the vicar of heaven on earth. There are no constitutional rules of political succession in a providential monarchy. There are no constitutional rules of succession in Islamic civilization, in Byzantine civilization, or in Russian civilization, ever. And to talk about constitutional law in Russia is to talk nonsense. Even right up to the end, there was no constitutional rule of succession. Alexander I left a note in his death saying that he wanted his second or third son, I forget which one it was, his second son, I believe, to be his successor. And that was an act of will, not an act of constitutional law. And this is the day, of course, in Russia today. Notice it's true in China. It always was true in China. China was a providential monarchy. But in the West, where we have the rule of law, where even God is under rules, the rules of ethics, you have a totally different situation, and you expect to have constitutional rules of political action, including the rules of political succession. Now, the Carolingian Empire, whose date it was built up in the course of 200 years approximately, let's say 687 to 887 approximately, 200 years, was an attempt to impose in the West a providential monarchy which was a heresy. Not in terms of the West's beliefs at the time, but in terms of the belief which were intrinsic in the nature of Western thought, including our belief in Christ. And in both of the Testaments. And while everyone that I read is full of praise about Charlemagne, Charlemagne was that kind of a willful man trying to do something that was impossible to do, which was to conquer practically the whole world. And he failed. The reason he failed was that he was doing it in a period of constantly deepening economic depression. And as a result of constant deepening economic depression, it became less and less possible even to conquer all the provinces of his own empire, and totally impossible to rule the provinces of his own empire. Because as the depression became worse and worse and worse, transportation broke down, all bridges collapsed. I've read some magnificent accounts of somebody trying to go from Chartres to Paris. I described this in half an hour, I guess, I don't know, went through traffic. And it took them something like 11 days. When they got there, the horse died of exhaustion. And they had to do such things as try and patch holes in bridges by taking the shield so the horse would fall through and so forth. All right, all commerce disappeared. Everybody was reduced to living off of the piece of land they were on, and this became the communities which are the root organizational patterns of the West. The local communities called the parish, the village, or the manor, whatever you want. It's local, it is self-sufficient. And one of the chief reasons that you could not, and Charlemagne could not, conquer great distance was it became economically impossible to capture any fortified building. Because you couldn't stay there long enough, you couldn't take enough men and enough food there to starve out the people inside, because anybody inside would have more food on hand than you could carry. And if you carried a very small amount of food, then you had to take a small number of men, in that case they'd come out and chase you away. So, we got then, after Charlemagne, and the last Carolingian is 887, he was removed for not fighting the Vikings sufficiently vigorously. And for 100 years there was no ruler. Instead, the whole society, and we call this a Dark Age. There is nothing wrong with a Dark Age. Dark Ages are in many cases the most productive period in the history of any civilization. And certainly in Western civilization they were. Any of you have read Lynn White's book on the technological advances of the Dark Ages, such as the plow and so forth, and harnessing, and so forth, know that we got a great deal. But out of the Dark Age that followed the collapse of the Carolingian Empire, we got the most magnificent thing which we had in our society. The recognition that people can have a society without having a state. In other words, the recognition that people can have a society without having a state. In other words, it's wiped away by experience, the assumption that is found all through classical antiquity except by unorthodox and heretical thinking, that the state and the society are identical, and that a state such as the imperium must be a society, therefore you can desire nothing more than to be a citizen. And if you want to go down in a ghetto or catacomb and be with your cozy co-believers and so forth, then you are an enemy. Because you are violating the fundamental assumption. Now, again, to get to the structure after this document. The Mediterranean has become a barrier. In the north, much neglected in our history books, but of vital importance, the Vikings were pouring outward. Before 750, they were pouring out. Raiders, slaves, pirates, men of violence and virility. And as you know, they occupied Iceland and they settled in Greenland and Newfoundland and so forth. And they went eastward into Russia, and started the beginnings of Russian civilization. Now I call this Northern Monarchy. It started as individual groups of pirate raiders. But it ended up, and that would be from 750 or so to 930. Then there was a brief lull, From 980 for 1,000 years to about 1080, they were coming out as monarchies. That is organized state structure. We call this Roman monarchy. I invented the title and had certain definite ideas. Where those ideas came from, I do not know, and it hasn't been discussed. It's possible that they got some of them from Byzantium, because the Vikings went across Russia all the way to the Black Sea and Byzantine. It's possible that they got it from the Carolingians, something namely the Carolingians. But notice the extraordinary thing about the Vikings, I can't spend too much time on that, that they went so far that they surrounded Europe. That is to say, the Vikings didn't just go to Newfoundland and places like that. They conquered Normandy in 911. They had conquered England several times, most recently in 1066. They had gone down and conquered southern Italy and Sicily. They had gone into Russia and it opened up the trade across Russia from the north down to the south. They had even attacked Constantinople and eventually had become the highest mercenary. And the extraordinary thing is this: in the battle in 1018 in southern Italy, Normans of Viking descent fighting on the side of the coast were in battle with so-called Varangians of Viking descent fighting in behalf of the Byzantine Empire. So there they had gone all the way around and were fighting. That northern monarchy is of very great significance, and it has things which seem very precocious. For example, it raised a military force, and it raised taxes on the basis of assessment on plots of land, which in England we call tithes, but they have different names, they're found in Russia too. They had standing armies. Archaeologists recently, that is to say in the last 25 years, have found 3 large camps in Denmark, built about the year 1000 by the king Sven Forkbeard, where his standing army was ready at any moment to embark in the ship and go off. The success of the Vikings, like the success of the raiders of the steppes of Asia, was in its mobility. But when the steppes of Asia mobility was based on horseback riding with an excellent weapon, the composite bow, the threat of the Vikings was their mobility on water. And they also had missile weapons. But by the year 1000, in Western Europe, you had a two-class society: peasants who produced food, and then a small percentage of fighters who fought on horseback with sharp weapons. And who, if they, that is, with spears, and who, if they were lucky, had a fortified house in which to live. That's all they needed. So we have a two-class society. Now, eventually, that two-class society began to develop. And when they come to the year 1150, we find that a new class has appeared as a separate class, the clergy. I won't say how this happened. So what you have is a monarch at the top. You have the nobility, who have weapons. You have the clergy, and you have the peasants at the bottom. But as I say, by the middle of the 12th century, you also have the beginnings of commerce, the rise of towns, the appearance of the middle class of commercial traders, so you have commercial traders. What the king did at the top was build a bureaucracy. That is, a group of people who could write, keep records, to handle cases of justice in his court, to keep track of the money he could raise in his treasury, and he built up these. Now there's the king, there is the feudal lords, L, there are the clergy, there are the bourgeoisie, the middle class, and there are the peasants who are out of it. All through this, they're out of it. They never have played any major political role. At first, the king used the clergy to gradually take away from the lords, the fighting men, powers that would make him stronger and stronger to build up a bureaucracy by doing it. But soon he discovered you can't trust the clergy. They are frequently much too loyal to the bishop or even to the pope. By that time, according to the king, built up his bureaucracy out of the bourgeoisie. He took the sons of middle-class, town-dwelling, commercial people who could read and write and count and put them in his bureaucracy. And this meant that you had the king of the bureaucracy recruiting and to some extent obtaining financial support from the bureaucracy, from the bourgeoisie. And it meant that the feudal lords and at least the upper clergy tended to come together and to cooperate in resistance to this. A 100 years after the last Carolingian died in 887, a microscopic lord near Paris was permitted by the 7 or 8 great lords who surrounded him, much more powerful than he was, to take the royal title. His name was Hugh Capet. The date is 987. Hugh Capet was the first of the Capetian kings, and he was allowed to take that title because he was so weak. They would not have permitted him any strength. In fact, the title of king, he was also allowed to take the title of suzerain, which means he was the top man in the feudal system. I will not attempt to define the feudal system if you don't know. So here the suzerain is combined with the king and a man who has no power, and it was done because he was pious and religious and weak. Now, as suzerain, he didn't have the powers of a real suzerain. A suzerain is simply a feudal lord that has no feudal lord above him. Because the feudal lords below him, who were technically his vassals, did not perform military service, did not come to his court to settle disputes, and had very little to do with him. But nevertheless, the power of his religious aura allowed him gradually to accumulate more and more and more power. Now, I want to say a few words about the title of king. King is a religious title. It means a ruler who has been consecrated